Just entered the no delusion zone. I'm David Dubato. Today, my very special guest is Dr. Sergi Kapanadze. Dr. Kapanadze is a professor of international relations and European integration at the Ilyas State and Caucasus Universities in Tbilisi, Georgia. Dr. Kapanadze is a senior researcher and head of the International Relations Department at the Research Institute Genommen Wise. He's a founder and chairman of the board of the Tbilisi-based think tank GRASS, Georgia's Reforms Associates. And Dr. Kapanadze was vice speaker of the parliament in Georgia from 2016 through 2020 and a deputy foreign minister in 2011 and 2012. He received a PhD in international relations from the Tbilisi State University in 2010 and an MA in International Relations and European Studies from the Central European University in 2003. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the No Delusion Zone Dr. Sergi Kapanadze. Sergi, welcome.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be here as a guest on your show.
Well, again, I'm very, very happy to have you here. Many of my viewers are well aware of what's going on in Georgia. And unfortunately, it's echoed to some degree in what's going on in my country right now, the United States, with the shadow of authoritarianism in a formerly democratic country. So it's quite heart-wrenching. Let's get started right away. You write a lot of articles on this, of course, and you speak about this. I'd like to first of all just get your thoughts on some recent history. How did Georgia arrive at this point from a fledgling democracy, which was pretty recently looking towards the West, integrating into Europe, the European Union, and the West generally, to where we are today with the authoritarian government, the mass riots, and so forth? Just if you could bring us up to speed or up to date with some recent history and why we are where we are today in Georgia.
That's a very complex question, but I think there is a logical explanation. So yes, Georgia used to be a beacon of democracy. It was hailed as such by many Western partners. But then there were several factors which are important to factor in. So the first one is that the previous administration by Mr. Saakashvili and the UNM, even though they had serious strides on democracy, they made a lot of mistakes as well, including on the human rights, including on different policies, which left a lot of people disheartened and discontent. Even though the track was right, even though the growth, economic or the democratic, was incomparable to what we had before, those mistakes made it possible for the Russian oligarchs to come to power in a democratic process through the democratic elections. So that was one factor. The other factor was that the influence of Russia. Russia and Mr. Putin and Kremlin, they've managed to use the weaknesses that we have internally, the absence of sort of resilience. They've used their propaganda and misinformation and FIMI really effectively throughout these years. In fact, the 2012 elections were also affected by the Russian FIMI, Russian foreign interference, including through the fake news, etc. But in addition to that, they also used the problems that the West had. Right after at that period, we had the so-called reset policy from the United States to Russia, and Russia used that reset policy very well to strengthen its presence here, as the United States was sort of withdrawing from Europe. Then they used the inability of the West to deal with invasion of Georgia in 2008, and they repeated it first in Crimea, then in Donbass, and then in Ukraine in 2022. And at the same time, they nurtured the local government here in Georgia, the oligarch who has made his fortune in Russia, who does not really have any allegiance to the European values, so to say. For him, what matters is his personal well-being, personal safety, grip and power. Sort of that's like his outlook on this world. So for him, the Western integration, European integration, friendship with our strategic partners like the United States, these Western values in general, it's just something that he can use in a transaction, whatever fits him, whatever is good for him. So in the first few years of his rule, he was sort of on the same track. He was on the Western track, at least verbally. But then, as soon as it became clear that the prospect of European integration actually entailed the reforms, including in the court system, including in media, including generally in the political landscape, it became also obvious to him that he might have lost power as a result of this reform. So he decided to strengthen his rule. He decided to ally more with Russia because Russia never asks you for any democratic reforms. For Russia, the more authoritarian you are and the more sort of strongman you are and the more human rights you violate and the more Russian type laws you adopt, as this government has done here, the better it is for them because they sort of, that's how they project their power. That's how they project in their neighborhood, basically telling also their own population, look, it's not just us who adopt the foreign agent laws or the anti-LGBT propaganda laws. It's also in Georgia. It's also in other countries around the neighborhood. So that's like we're sort of resisting the Western encroachment this way. And so this government embraced those practices that Russia had. And we've then had a number of crises internally when those who were protecting democracy, including in the opposition, including in the civil society, in free media, as well as our foreign friends. We resisted this in 2020, in 2021, but step by step by step, we've come to the point when the Georgian dream has become as authoritarian as it has never been. Not just by the laws, but also by the actions, the way they treat the political opposition, the way they arrest any opponent, the way they mishandle, torture literally the protesters who are being arrested for simply wearing a mask, for simply wearing a balaclava, for having the you know that they just passed a law where they can actually arrest somebody preemptively. It's not that somebody has done something wrong, but because the police can say, I think you're going to break the law, so I'm going to preemptively put you in jail for a few days. And for instance, possessing the fireworks or the fireworks. Having the fireworks has now become illegal because the Georgians used the fireworks in the protest just to show that they were discontent with the U-turn in the foreign policy, turning away from the European Union. So these laws that they've passed just recently, I'm talking about the laws that have been passed in December, not even talking about the laws they've passed last year, earlier, like the foreign agents law, which directly targets the civil society and media, or the so-called anti-LGBT propaganda law, which is an absurd creation in general. The concept is absurd, but that is a favorite thing that Russians and Kremlin does, because for them, that is something they can use for the domestic propaganda purposes to rally around the authoritarian flag, the conservative society that we are. We are a conservative society. We are the Orthodox Christian society. So using those pressure points has become the handwriting of Kremlin, and now has become the handwriting of the Georgian dream. So that's how we got here, step by step by step. Now, I also have to say that what also contributed to this is that I think the Western friends of ours have given too much credit to Mr. Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream throughout these years. They were closing eyes on what obviously was the window dressing of reforms. They were closing eyes when the Georgian Dream was deceiving them blatantly in their face, the EU's and the Western partners, the US, saying that, oh, we are conducting the third wave of the judicial reform. When it was clear that all they were doing was basically strengthening their grip on the court, when they were saying, "Oh, we're conducting the electoral reform," when all they were doing is they were creating the system which was more conducive to them staying in power, when they were saying, "Oh, we are trying to, for instance, adopt the laws that also West has," and yes, in some Western countries there are laws which, if you apply in the authoritarian country, it's going to be a disaster. But in the countries like for instance, you have the laws which might be limiting the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression in the Western country. But then you have the court, and the court is a guarantee that that is not going to be misused. But in a country like Georgia, where you have the full control of the courts, any sort of restrictive law that you import from the West is going to be used exactly against against the civil society or against the protest or to suppress the dissent. So I think the West has given a lot of undue credit to the Georgian dream, and they've misused it really brilliantly, I would say. And I think the last episode of that was in 2 years ago, in 2023, when despite not delivering on the EU requested reforms to get the candidate status, despite only delivering on three relatively minor blocks of reforms out of 12, one quarter, one fourth, basically, and they, nonetheless, the EU gave us the Georgians, and they actually made it very clear to the population, they granted us the candidate status. But then this was misused by the government, sort of to say to the supporters that they had that, look, whatever we've been doing, we were criticized, but actually it worked because we also got the candidate status. So, and it also gave the Georgian Dream, I think, the feeling that they could, they could beat about the bush, they could maneuver their way out of the pressure from the West, they could misuse sort of the credit that they were given, and they could get away with it. And I think that's one of the reasons why they have now found themselves in the position when they are fully ostracized, when they are unhandshakable, basically, from any Western partner, whether Western Europe or Eastern Europe, from the United States. I think because they also got themselves in this position. Sorry for the sort of a long
no,
introduction,
that's terrific.
It's impossible to talk about this shortly.
No, as you said, it's very complicated. It goes very deep, and I wanted exactly the kind of summary that you gave. No, so thank you. We're going to come back to talking about Russian disinformation in a moment, but I want to ask you a question. The West, obviously, the West, when I say the West, Europe, the United States, the West generally has made so many missteps regarding Georgia, in my opinion. Let me ask you, did the failure of the West to take any real steps against Russia during the war of 2008 and the subsequent occupation of the northern South Ossetia, the northern part of Georgia, did that take did that contribute to what you're just talking about? Did it take the wind out of the sails of some of the opposition, and did it give more strength to the Georgian dream, to the Georgian government to affiliate, to draw closer to Russia after that?
Right. So there are a few lines there. The first one is that in early 2009, the feeling I think Kremlin had was that they actually got away with the invasion of Georgia, because all the kind of sanctions or the restrictions imposed on Russia were literally lifted in 2009. And so basically Putin invaded a neighboring country under the completely false pretext, which was even at that time clear, but because of the Russian misinformation, we actually had to fight it back to persuade our partners, which was obvious that this was not Georgia's fault, as Russia was claiming, but this was actually the Russian invasion of a sovereign country. Now, we succeeded more or less with quite a serious diplomatic hurdle, so to say, and efforts to do that. But the lesson that the Russians got was that they could get away with it. At that time, I remember we were speaking with our friends and very often referring to the same could happen in Crimea. Actually, if you go into WikiLeaks, you will see it there. It's in some WikiLeaks cables there when these crazy Georgians are warning Americans in the West that, Russia can do the same in Crimea. And everybody was like, okay, what are you talking about? Crimea, impossible. It happened literally in 5 years from the time when we were warning about it. So I think the sort of the good lesson for Russia was that they could actually repeat this elsewhere and expect the West not to react. Or if the West reacted, they would have been ready to minimize the damage as a result of that. And I think the sanctions after Crimea, which were more substantial, obviously, a lot more substantial than the sanctions in case of Georgia. In the case of Georgia, there were not really a lot of sanctions, to be honest. But I think those sanctions then prompted Russia to think that, we can actually go further. We can actually go further. We can actually go further in Donbass, and then we can actually invade Ukraine. And, if the invasion does not last that long, and we can just finish this business in a few weeks or maybe months. Whatever sanctions the West is going to hit us with, they're just going to go away because we'll be the victors. So I think this created this image in Kremlin that they have impunity. There's no real strategy. There's no real instrument that can hurt them from the West. And at that time, let's make no mistake, I think they were absolutely sure that whatever they did would not have affected the energy policy of the EU or the energy policy of the United States, that the West would have still continued being dependent on Russian energy. And they were also quite sure that the West would have still been susceptible to the misinformation and the sort of theme that they are employing all across, not only in the United States, but also in Europe very frequently. So that's one thing. The other thing I think which contributed to where we are now is that the Georgian Dream and Mr. Ivanishvili, they have made I think, once again, politics is no morality, I understand that. But in the small countries where you ought to find partners, especially when you're a weak state, small state like Georgia is, obviously. It's about the size, it's about the geography, it's about economy. Countries like Georgia are the small states as they're qualified in international relations, right? I think it's a duty of a ruler in these kind of states to find stronger partners who are going to balance the threats which are coming from your traditional enemies, if you have traditional enemies. Now, unfortunately, we do have traditional enemies. It's not something that we have invented. The Russians have invaded us in 1801. Then we had several other suppressions throughout the 19th century. Then they reconquered Georgia in 1921. Then we had the wars in the 90s, War of 2008. I mean, what else do you need to understand that Russia is your enemy, right? And so what the Georgian Dream did is that they acted, I would say, immorally and non-pragmatically, irresponsibly, when they decided to use the threats coming from Russia. As I said, for the last 2 centuries, these threats were there. So the threat coming from Russia to manipulate the historical pains that the Georgian population has because of these confrontations and the wars with Russia, and to argue that unless we become pro-Russian or unless we get into bed with Russia, we're going to have the war, like Ukraine. And so they positioned themselves as, and what I think also the biggest immorality, they positioned themselves to argue that it's actually Ukraine's fault what is happening in Ukraine. And if it had not been for the resistance from the Ukrainians, Ukrainian babies would not be dying. I mean, they went as far here when we had the pre-election campaign. They went as far as to put out the billboards which showed destroyed Ukrainian cities, hospitals, theaters, and on the same billboard they showed the prospering Georgian cities, theaters, etc. To draw the parallel to say that if you don't choose us, you're going to get like Ukraine, as if it's not the Russia's fault, but as if it is the Western and the Ukrainian fault that's happening there. And I think that is also, if we zoom out a little bit, I think that is also very non-pragmatic, because with that approach, you put yourself under Russian total domination, where it really comes to their decision what to do with you. And let's make no mistake, in this situation in which we are now, we are the least secure, most volatile. Because if Russia tomorrow decides to introduce their troops to Georgia, even our Western partners will not have an appetite to protect us or to even counter us, because this government is not handshakable from the perspective of the West. So we have actually weakened ourselves, only leaving ourselves at the mercy of Russia. And the final point here is that I think the analysis of the global event shows really well what happens to those countries who leave themselves at the mercy of Russia. Mr. Assad, just recently, his only backbone staying in power was the Russian support, and then by extension also the Iranian support, right? And when it came to that moment, Russians just abandoned him. So I think it's very clear that putting yourself at the mercy of Russia and just Mr. Putin and expecting that just because you're becoming pro-Russia, they're not going to have any more they're not going to attack you, they're not going to encroach on you any longer. I think it's just so short-sighted. And let's make no mistake, we have 2 occupied regions, which you mentioned, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that have been occupied. The Russia has been there, dominance in the 90s, but they've formally occupied in 2008. In Abkhazia, just recently, they've still been pushing the laws to make Abkhazia, which is fully dependent on them, economy-wise, budget-wise, security-wise. They've been for years parachuting people from Russia to hold offices in South Ossetia, for instance. So in a territory which is so much dependent on them, they've still gone as far as to push the laws that they want, which allow them to take land. They've now taken basically one village away. In addition, this huge empire, the Russian Empire, is fighting for one village in Abkhazia. They've taken the dacha, the so-called, the holiday place that used to belong to Stalin. So these guys don't stop. This is the worst strategy to give in to Russia and hope that they are going to stop. And I hope that this mistake is not made. Yes, this government is making this mistake, and that's why we feel responsible to counter it, to be in a resistance to it, to the street protests, political process, whatever. But I really, really, really hope that neither in the United States, the decision makers, including the new President Trump, or in the European Union, this school of thought, which says that you need to give in to Russia, you need to allow them to get whatever they want, at least part of it, and let them stop, let's appease them. I hope this is not the strategy which is chosen, because it's gonna end the same way that it ended with Hitler. The difference being that this is the nuclear power, and the difference being that they're a lot more, I would say, a lot more atrocious in their foreign wars. And I know it might sound paradoxical, but doing the same atrocities in the 21st century that they do in Ukraine, it's incomparable to what Hitler did. It was still 1930s. It was a different world. It was a different approach towards the human rights. It was a different approach towards the minority. So doing that at that time obviously was as atrocious as we've never seen before. But when you repeat this now in the 21st century, we should understand that we're talking about people who are ready to go at great lengths, who are ready to do the genocide in the 21st century. So I think giving in to them is the shortcut to disaster for the European and American security.
Sergei, you made a comment in one of the pieces that you wrote fairly recently, where you said one of the unique features of what's going on in Georgia right now is that when Russia usually puts the pressure on a country to side with Russia instead of leaning towards the West, it's the people, the people of that country that fall victim to Russian disinformation, where in Georgia, it's the government who capitulated first and is siding with Georgia, and the people are protesting this. Could you talk a little bit about that thought?
Right. So we've seen how the Western world has become very susceptible to the Russian and Chinese disinformation in the last decade or so. I think they've mastered the phenomenon of using the information and then sort of building the narrative, which then weakens those societies that they plan to attack, either physically through the military means or otherwise, politically, economically, etc. So what we've also seen is that a lot of these countries who are targeted targeted by the foreign information manipulation interferences, the FIMI, in those countries, you usually have the government, in an absolute majority of the cases, who together with the society try to build the resilience and counter that. And you have a lot of attempts in the European Union, at the institutional level, as well as in the countries of the EU, as well as in the United States, the UK, who try to counter this disinformation, because they understand that disinformation is something that can poison the society and weaken the society and make Russia stronger and make them achieve their goals easier. Now, in Georgia's case, what we have, the uniqueness of the situation, is that the government is the one who, they don't fight it. They embrace this disinformation and they use it also for their own domestic political purpose. For instance, there are several widespread disinformation narratives that Russia has. So one of them is that it was the West who is to blame for the war in Ukraine. It was the NATO expansion that is to blame. That is to blame. It's the Western powers who wanted this sort of confrontation, and they're using Ukraine to be in the war with Russia. That's a very dominant Russian narrative that you see across the spectrum in the social media, in the mainstream media, and the politician statement. This government, against all odds, very paradoxically, adopted the same narrative. With a little twist where they say that, it's the West wanted the war in Ukraine. It's their fault. It is Zelensky's fault. But now they also want Georgia to be involved in the war with Russia, which, if you think about it for a second, is the most absurd claim one can think of. Because why in the world would anybody in the West, in its right mind, want Georgia to engage in war with Russia, knowing really well that Russia is going to score a very easy military victory in Georgia, and so it's going to, in Ukraine, they've been having more or less, successes and failures, but it has been, ups and downs. But here they would have a, really quickly the success. So why would anybody want to grant that success to Russia and Georgia, right? So it doesn't make sense. It's not a logical argument. It's just the emotional argument where they appeal to people saying that, you know what, this is what's happening, and we're here to protect you from the Western attempt to engage us in a second front against Russia. Now, the problem is that they cannot really pinpoint who says that. They cannot pinpoint, oh, this was the U.S., I don't know, the state secretary or the U.S. president or some minister. So what they've invented is a boogeyman that they call the global war party, which is, once again, another absurd statement. Like, they basically been arguing here for the last few years that it is the global war party, verbatim, who has been attempting to drag Georgia into war. When they are drilled, who is this global war party, the answers on this detailed question range from the Freemasons to some conspiracy theories, some guys, wearing some masks somewhere in the room, pulling the string, which is, once again, absurd, because there is no real answer to this. It is just an invention that they use for the domestic political purposes. So that's one propaganda. There's a number of other propagandas that for instance, the propaganda they've also entailed is that anybody who is against this regime is the agent of the West. And that is a 100% Russian narrative, because for Russia to make this argument internally, when they suppressed the protests at Bolotnaya and also before that, to justify why Nemtsov would be killed, or why Navalny would be arrested and then killed, or why they should get rid of the free media, the only sort of logical Soviet type argument was that, oh, they are all agents of the West. And since we are in this confrontation with the West, we need to get rid of these agents. So in Russia, it is just as absurd, but it's understandable, because there is this whole aura of hatred of the agents, of spies, comes from the Soviet times, during the Second World War, in the interwar period when the Communist Party was really fighting the agents. So it's a known thing for a Soviet person, for a Russian person. But in Georgia, it is completely absurd. But nonetheless, this government, this regime, went as far as to adopt exactly the same narrative. And let's make no mistake, they've gone far. They've gone farther than the Russians have done. And some of the laws they've adopted are not the kind of laws that Russians adopted back when they started this. So, and now when they're in the rhetoric, it is a normal, everyday, basically, statement when they say, "Oh, you are an agent." It's become like a normal conversation. It's whether they talk about the political opponents or the critical journalists or the civil society or academia or whoever is against them, they are the agents. So when they get the criticism from the West, that's the global war party. When they get criticism from the internally, they are all agents of this global war party. And that is, once again, I think it in a way downgrades even me and you here in this discussion intellectually when we have to talk about these completely absurd conspiracy theories. But that's where we are, and that is a serious problem for this country's security, because instead of being engaged in a real survival game, in different strategies, how to counter Russia's interest in this region, how to make the West more stronger here, how to be more democratic, more appealing, how to pursue the window of opportunity that the EU has opened for us in terms of the European integration. Instead of doing all this, the whole rhetoric here is about, oh, we're fighting some mysterious global war party and everybody is an agent. And so it's all justified. If we arrest a journalist and put her in jail for a few months and then possibly sentence her for a few years just because she countered the policeman and in the affect, kind of slapped her. Nothing serious. It might sound like, slapping an officer. No, in this case, in this country, it was not like that. When you do that, or when you arrest a political leader simply because he wanted just to go back to his office, or when you when you beat almost to death a civil activist or a political leader, this is the kind of country in which we woke up. Well, we didn't wake up overnight, obviously, but in which we've been waking up in the last few years. So yeah, we are in a very dire situation, and propaganda and misinformation that comes from Russia has been used by this government to to meet their own political goals. And I think the final point on this is that I think the lesson they got from this is that they can sacrifice anything except for the propaganda machinery. Like this regime now rests on two pillars. One is the brutal use of force and the so-called law enforcers or the special police, whoever they have, the people with the masks who can drag you in the street, beat you up, put you in jail, beat you up there. So that's like one brutal force, but not just the brutal force. And then it's the propaganda machinery through their controlled immediate TV channel, through their controlled Rustavi2 TV channel, through the public broadcaster, which they've managed to suffocate and get under their own control, and in social media. So this is like the architecture and anatomy of their state capture.
Sergei, let's wrap up this discussion with one question that actually circles back to one of your recent articles. With protests, street protests, still raging throughout Georgia, would you say that right now there is in fact mortal combat going on for Georgia's future, an existential combat for the future of Georgia?
Yes, and one of the reasons why I titled the article as Mortal Kombat, which came out in Geopolitics, it's the monthly journal that we're producing here in Georgia, it's monthly Georgia's Foreign Policy Journal. So the reason why I titled this Mortal Kombat was that indeed it is a combat between the pro-democracy forces, which is the civil society with its widest understanding, because it's not just the non-governmental organizations, it's a lot of self-organized groups, many of them organized in social media. It's the free media, critical media, who's been at the forefront of this battle for the democracy in this country. It's the opposition parties who have a lot of problems internally with the rest of society, whatever. But yes, they've been on the right track in terms of countering these authoritarian tendencies. And by the way, let's make no mistake, they've been the recipients of the most violence, of the most hatred, and the most misinformation in this country. And so for many people, it's not really clear what is true and what is not, because they've been the targets of this for many, many years. And so this is on the one hand. And on the other hand, it is the regime, Mr. Ivanishvili and his political party, who right now struggles with a double illegitimacy. They struggle with the legitimacy at home because of the rigged elections, because of these protests, and because how they behave, because how they put people in jail, because how the kind of violence they use. But they also struggle with the issue of legitimacy abroad. They haven't been congratulated by any European Union state except for Hungary and some of those countries who are playing the same game. Basically, they have not been invited to any high-level meetings. They have not been invited to Davos. They have not been invited to any bilateral meeting. They have not been invited to the United States. In the United States, there's a bipartisan understanding of what is happening in this country, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. They've been quite adamantly clear that the track on which Georgia is not acceptable. So it's not a partisan issue in the United States, and Georgian Dream has failed to capture this. By the way, they were hoping that on the January 20th, when Trump enters into force, they would all of a sudden get the kind of a reset, but it didn't happen because I understand they want to get some sort of they are hoping that maybe if they speak enough Trump speak, so to say, so if they say enough words that Trump hears, like deep state. One of the recent things that they've been accentuating here is that Georgia is actually fighting the deep state. So the global war party has been replaced by now the deep state, because they know that in Trumpian vocabulary and in his rhetoric, deep state is also something that sort of he's against. And once again, we might like or dislike or agree or disagree with what Trump means under the deep state, but there's a certain political logic in what Trump is trying to do. Once again, this is not a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of what he wants to achieve with that. What Trump wants to achieve is that he wants to have less sort of dissent in the system that he is running. Here, deep state is the same boogeyman as the global war party. And once again, the propaganda is really trying their best to to replace these two words sort of as if they are synonymous. But coming back to your question, so the combat here, this confrontation is truly kind of a life and death issue. First of all, for Georgian democracy, because if the Georgian dream prevails, and there's only one way to prevail, basically, by breaking the will of those who are resisting. There's no other way to prevail in this. And to achieve that, they need to get more violent. They need to arrest more people. They need to suppress it. They need to they need to break the will physically, emotionally, financially of those who want democracy in this country. Now, I'm not saying this is impossible. I think it's possible. I think there's not a single country in this world where authoritarianism cannot bounce back. I think it is in the human nature to be susceptible to certain pressures, whether it is information or whatever. And even the greatest countries have had the rise of authoritarianism. You know, one might argue that in the United States, as you implied in the beginning, there is a rise of authoritarianism today. One might disagree with that, but we've seen countries like Greece, which was the cradle of democracy, had consecutive authoritarian sort of tendencies throughout the years. The same was in Spain. The same was in Italy. The same was in Germany. So let's make no mistake. I mean, Georgia was the part of the authoritarian tyranny of the Soviet Union for 70 years. So I don't buy the argument that, oh, in this country you cannot have authoritarian. Sure, you can. It's just that right now we still have forces who are resisting, and these forces need support. So if they lose this battle, it's going to be a win by authoritarian. It's going to be by Russia by default, because any authoritarian success in the world is the, by extension, success of Kremlin and Moscow. I mean, you cannot name a single viable democratic state who is now in Russia's camp, literally. And those who are trying to be transactional about it just because they have their own concrete interests. But when it comes, by the end of the day, they will always take the right position, be on the side of democracy in the West. So it's either that, or it's the demise and it's a mortal outcome for the regime. Because this regime, I think they've gone too far to understand that it is not sustainable for them to expect or to hope for a normal transition of power. Because when you rig the elections, when you arrest almost all the political opponents, when you use violence against the children, when I say children, teenagers who are protesting, when you adopt the laws, when you stigmatize the society and polarize it and say that, like half of you are agents, I mean, it's not something you can then normally expect which is going to go away if you all of a sudden concede the electoral loss. Well, that's why it's a mortal combat. But I think, and the final point of this is, I think it has a larger repercussions than just for Georgia, because Georgia, as you also mentioned, has been a poster child of democracy in this part of the world. Because of all the hurdles we've overcome, because of all the problems we've had in the 90s, the wars, the internal sort of disagreements, nonetheless, we managed to build a state. We were a failed state. I mean, let's make no mistake. 30 years ago, Georgia was a failed state. And we managed to get over that. And you don't have a lot of examples where a failed state becomes a functioning state in this world. I mean, you might think of 5, 6, maybe 10 at most, but not many, right? So we managed to get over that. We managed to build a state, the institutions, to have a democracy, to have a vibrant civil society, as was often quoted throughout throughout different reports in the world. Viable political process, state institutions, more or less viable economy, despite the conflicts we have, despite the occupation, etc. And so if this can happen in this country, if the democracy can be reversed and the Lukashenko type or the Kremlin type authoritarianism becomes possible here, it's the best message Russia can get. They can try to do the same in Eastern Europe, whether it's Romania or whether it's I'm not even going to name, whether it's Hungary or Slovakia or Poland or Baltic states, because the instruments are here. Oh, it worked in Georgia. Oh, let's try and make it work elsewhere, or maybe in some Western European countries, because all the instruments are there. They have the money, they have the local forces who are there, they have the misinformation, they have other leverages, whether it's economic, political, etc. And if they get away here, what's going to make them not get away elsewhere? And it's the same logic with Ukraine. If they succeed in Ukraine and finish this war on their terms, with taking of the territory and coming out the winners, let's ask ourselves the question: what's going to stop them from doing the same, replicating the same in the Baltic states, in Romania, Bulgaria, or any other Eastern European country? And that's not where they're going to stop. Sorry, it was too long, but very
Not at
interesting
all.
question. So it's possible to answer them really briefly.
Sergey, it's not too long at all. You're in a very difficult situation there. You're passionate about it. You should be, and I appreciate your passion and the information that you've given us. We're going to have to leave it there for today. Dr. Sergi Kapanadze, professor of international relations and European integration in Tbilisi, Georgia. He was also a former vice speaker of the Parliament of Georgia, as well as a former deputy foreign minister. Sergei, you take care, stay safe, and stay sane.